They won't tell you outright, but it's not what you think causes people to become chilly around you. It's not your words, your face, or even your errors. It's a deeper, more subdued sound. The way you don't respond as they anticipate. Your quiet seems more weighty than their cacophony. The way you refuse to pursue acceptance, even when it is obviously being provided as a test. People don't just dislike you. You reflect what left you keep them matched to the because their masks are more difficult to fit around you. Their jokes don't have the same effect. They no longer feel in control, and that discomfort has a tendency to manifest as judgment, distance, or subtle resistance. This is the bit that no one speaks aloud, though. Fitting in was never really the goal. It's not usually referred to as resistance. The majority of individuals won't even acknowledge it to themselves. However, you become aware of patterns as soon as your energy enters a space and things begin to slightly change. Easy conversations turn into selective ones. Around you, laughter seems a little forced. Some people become quieter when you stop responding the manner they are accustomed to, not because you said more. When purpose and perception diverge, misinterpreted energy starts. They interpreted energy starts. They interpreted energy starts. They interpreted energy starts. They interpreted it. They may perceive you as placing yourself above them, even though you are merely existing in your own alignment. The first fissure where resistance emerges is the difference between who you are and how others interpret you. Predictable energy makes people feel at ease. They comprehend those who reflect them, react fast, make noise when there is silence, and validate without hesitation. However, the mind begins to look for reasons when someone enters who does not follow that pattern. And assumptions take control in the absence of explanations. That is the source of miscommunication. Your silence starts to raise suspicions. Your self-assurance is called ego. Your consciousness is misinterpreted as criticism. Your presence upsets the unwritten agreements individuals depend on to feel safe in social settings, not because you said anything harsh. Instead of the reflection they anticipate, they are instead of the reflection. Furthermore, neutrality feels like rejection in a society that is dependent on approval. Not every resistance is audible. Withdrawal might be subtle at times. Around you, people stop sharing as much. They begin selecting conversations that are safer. They start changing their behavior because your energy takes away the comfort of illusion, not because you ask them to. They are no longer able to perform subconsciously since something in your presence alerts them to the existence of performance. This is the point at which miscommunication intensifies. They project their discomfort outward rather than acknowledging it. Even if you were merely the trigger that made the shift visible, you end up being the cause of it. They claim that you have changed, but in actuality, you have just ceased adapting to their comfort, and the illusion of harmony ends as soon as you stop making adjustments. The fact that misinterpreted energy doesn't make an announcement adds to the complexity of this situation. It doesn't dispute. It doesn't provide defense. It takes time to rectify perception. For those who depend on emotional regularity, the fact that it just exists becomes enough to unsettle them. They have no idea how to classify someone who doesn't want to be liked, but also doesn't want to be hated. This resistance builds distance over time. Emotional and psychological, but not always physical. You stay in the same area, but people's ability to observe your responses gradually diminishes. They are no longer able to predict you, and those who are accustomed to control through familiarity find unpredictability unsettling. Thus, the simplest explanation is misunderstanding. It shields them from having to consider their own responses. Instead of reflecting, it enables them to classify. Beneath all of that, the truth is still the same, but it lends structure to something they find difficult to describe. The energy was always correct. It was just too unfamiliar to be accepted without resistance. Seldom do people acknowledge what really bothers them. Looking inward and identifying the reflection in front of them is more difficult than labeling, distancing, and criticizing. When someone doesn't give in to pressure, doesn't look for approval, and doesn't engage in emotional games, it makes other people feel uncomfortable in a way that they find difficult to articulate. Rejection is frequently used as a cover for that discomfort. Beneath that, though, is something much more intimate. It's not necessarily evident or loud to be insecure. Jokes, quiet, and selective adjuration are some of the ways it might be concealed. And when someone enters that space with confidence, not theatrical confidence, but grounded self-awareness, it starts to reveal aspects of themselves that others have been avoiding. Contrast is inevitable because of you, not because you brought it up. When their surroundings support their internal story, people feel at ease. They favor those who feel little if they feel ignored. They favor people who validate their sense of superiority. However, an imbalance is created when someone who doesn't fit into either category shows up, someone who just exists without seeking permission. It is illogical to have that imbalance. Insecurity always responds first on an emotional level. They begin to see your independence as pride, your peacefulness as detachment, and your confidence as haughtiness. These interpretations are based on the discomfort your presence causes in them rather than just what you do. Because people start making unintentional comparisons in their hearts, not your achievement but your assurance, not your accomplishments but your absence of seeming uncertainty. Insecurity turns defensive at that point. It rewrites vision to defend itself. It assumes that you must be doing something incorrectly rather than inquiring as to why your presence feels menacing. It is simpler to place blame elsewhere than to acknowledge that someone else's stability is drawing attention to their own instability. Seldom is the subsequent rejection specifically directed at you. It has to do with what you inadvertently disclose. People are reminded of their own inconsistencies when they witness your consistency. They are reminded of their emotional dependence when they witness emotional control. They are reminded of their dependence on approbation when they witness self-sufficiency. Such reminders are also not always appreciated. They thereby produce distance, sometimes by remaining silent, sometimes by making subtle criticisms, and occasionally by withdrawing entirely. They can no longer overlook their internal gaps because of your presence, not because you altered your behavior. You turn into a mirror that they refuse to look into, and they turn away from it rather than confront what it reveals. This is further complicated by the fact that insecurity is not always self-aware. The person reacting might sincerely think they are reacting to you, but in actuality they are reacting to what you have triggered in them. They believe you are making them feel small because they feel that way. They believe you are purposefully exposing them because they feel vulnerable. Although the discomfort has an inside source, the blame is externalized. And as this cycle goes on, miscommunication turns into judgment. Distance hardens judgment. Distance starts to be accepted as simply not getting along. But the core is still the same underneath it all. They don't resent your presence per se, but rather the way it brings to light aspects of themselves that they haven't yet figured out how to deal with. Before it gains people's admiration, authenticity has a peculiar way of making them uneasy. It appears innocuous and even admirable at first, but only until it begins to defy expectations. Subtle agreements and unwritten standards about how much of yourself you may display, how much confidence is okay before it becomes excessive, and how much honesty is allowed before it becomes impolite, are the foundation of most social contexts. Perception begins to change as soon as a person crosses those invisible lines. Sometimes the lack of performance is what is commonly referred to as arrogance. People find it difficult to comprehend the contrast that arises when you don't continually modify your personality to match different settings, soften your thoughts for approval, or reduce your presence to make others feel more at ease. They're accustomed to interaction being carefully chosen, swamped in. That filter is eliminated by authenticity. Authenticity seems disturbing to people who rely on performance. It is hard to classify because it does not reflect their expectations. Furthermore, classifications are preferred by the human mind over ambiguity. Thus, it is branded rather than accepted for what it is. Self-assurance turns into ego. Being honest turns into being blunt. Respect for oneself turns into pride. They reestablish a sense of psychic authority, not because the bully like it's their way of Usually the discomfort begins silently. A person speaks freely without worrying too much about how others may see them. They don't apologize excessively for their beliefs. They don't change their tone all the time to stay in tune. And all of a sudden, those in their immediate vicinity start to see that conduct in a skewed way. It feels strange, and strangeness is frequently misinterpreted as danger. The buffer that people use to prevent emotional conflict is eliminated by authenticity. When it is there is less space for passive expectations, less room for manipulation, and less chance to discern concealed intents when none exist. For those accustomed to uncertainty, that clarity might feel profound. People begin to feel exposed in unexpected ways when things are not carefully controlled or emotionally edited. Thus, the response starts. Initially, there was a slight distance, a change in tone, and a decrease in transparency. The redefinition of toes. Simple remarks are interpreted as criticism. A composed reaction is interpreted as dominance. Lack of explanation is interpreted as a sign of apathy. The idea of authenticity has been altered to suit comfort levels, but the authenticity itself has not changed. It's frequently forgotten that being real doesn't lead to conflict by disparaging other people. By eliminating the requirement for continuous validation exchange, it causes strain. Someone who operates outside of social approval loops inherently stands out in environments where people largely rely on them. They are no longer engaged in the same quiet conversation, not because they are attempting to. This is the point at which miscommunication turns into presumption. People attribute purpose rather than identifying differences. They turn originality into a social danger rather than embracing it. Furthermore, since consistency eliminates the possibility that the misreading is a passing phase, the more consistent the authenticity, the stronger the misperception. People eventually start to equate distance with genuineness. It no longer draws them in through performance, not because it pushes them away. There is no forced alignment to maintain harmony, no excessive warmth to maintain comfort, and no self-alteration to conform to expectations. Additionally, that lack of adaptation feels like rejection to people who depend on emotional consistency. Boundaries are rarely comprehended when they are developed, even when they are nothing more than raw existence. The majority of individuals only become aware of them when they are no longer able to freely cross them. Before that, access seems commonplace, almost presumptive. Until someone decides otherwise, time, attention, emotional space, and availability are frequently regarded as open. And when that change occurs, the initial response is typically perplexity, which is swiftly followed by discomfort. Boundaries are first difficult for people accustomed to unrestricted access to understand as self-respect. They see them as being far away. They don't see structure when you stop responding right away, stop giving lengthy explanations, and stop being there whenever they need you. It appears to be change, and change is frequently confused with withdrawal. They now believe that access, which was previously predictable, is conditional. Boundaries don't make noise. They don't make a confrontational announcement. They manifest subtly in behavior, such as a delayed reaction, an unjustified refusal, or a time when you decide not to push yourself too far in order to keep the peace. Even if they are unaware of the change, these little choices gradually alter how people relate to you. People accustomed to unrestricted emotional or social availability may find this change perplexing. Sometimes, without realizing it, they start testing it. They may wait for you to revert to your old habits, push a little harder, or anticipate a familiar response. Interpretation begins to take shape when that doesn't occur. And interpretation turns into narrative whenever it takes the place of comprehension. Seldom is that story objective. Boundaries may be labeled as attitude, arrogance, or emotional detachment rather than as a sign of self-respect. Their expectation of unrestricted access has been disrupted, not because of your hostile actions. They are responding to the limitations of your action rather than the action itself. Dependency is also revealed by boundaries. Any decrease in emotional availability when someone is accustomed to it shows how much they depended on it. And it's not always easy to accept. It makes them aware of patterns they would not have noticed before. Therefore, it is frequently rerouted externally rather than being processed internally. Instead of the dependency itself, the person establishing the boundary becomes the target of annoyance. When limits emerge in a relationship, there is also a silent recalibration. Roles start to change. The once approachable person starts to become picky. The person who used to continually adjust stopped doing so. The balance of expectations also shifts during that transition. What was once taken for granted now demands awareness, and awareness demands work. Resistance is a common reaction from those who are not accustomed to that effort. Subtle kinds of resistance, rather than direct ones. Withdrawing emotionally, communicating less, making passive comments, or even reinterpreting previous actions. Moments that were previously considered typical are suddenly re-examined from a different perspective. The boundary changes how people see the past, in addition to having an impact on current interactions. Boundaries are powerful because they are about structure rather than rejection. They define connection rather than eradicate it. However, emotional perception frequently obscures this distinction because it feels personal when access is restricted, even if that is not the intention. Boundaries start to take on names they weren't supposed to, since the mind finds it difficult to distinguish between isolation and self-respect. They are perceived as coldness rather than clarity. They are perceived as separation rather than as equilibrium. And for others who previously profited from that overstretching, the person who just decided to cease doing so becomes a symbol of unease. People are more unnerved by silence than by speech. Words soften perception, defend, explain, and justify. None of that is accomplished by silence. It leaves room, and instead of being steered, people are compelled to interpret. Furthermore, unrestrained interpretation seldom remains impartial. When someone ceases responding in the way that others anticipate, superiority rather than peace is typically assumed. Seldom is silence interpreted as internal control. It is more frequently misinterpreted as disdain, emotional detachment, or covert judgment. People project their own discomfort into quiet, not because silence has those meanings. Silence is perceived as an interruption in settings where continuous communication is the norm. People are accustomed to verbal reassurance, emotional cues, feedback loops, and quick reactions. When such signs are eliminated, the mind begins to fill in the blanks, and what it does so frequently reveals more about the observer than the silent person. Interaction loses control when there is silence. People find it difficult to place you within their expectations when you don't explain yourself. They start speculating because they are unable to verify your intentions through your words. Furthermore, speculation produces stories. Because ambiguity is frequently uncomfortable and discomfort seeks resolution, those tales are rarely compassionate. When silence takes the place of response, there is also a slight change. Individuals who are accustomed to eliciting reactions start to realize that their typical triggers are no longer effective. What used to result in quick defense, explanation, or emotional involvement now results in nothing at all. Additionally, control feels lost when nothing is seen. This loss is frequently perceived as silent condemnation or emotional retreat. Although silence doesn't start arguments, it makes others think about them. Although it doesn't accuse, it is frequently interpreted as such. It is viewed as contrast even when it does not compare. This inconsistency is the source of miscommunication. Others transfer their own anxieties, presumptions, and insecurities onto the blank surface created by the lack of the fact that silence is not meaningless is frequently disregarded. It has a lot of internal processing that doesn't need to be verified externally. However, that internal condition is invisible to people who depend on outside feedback to comprehend emotional reality, and assumptions frequently take the place of what cannot be seen. Silence disturbs expectations in social dynamics. People anticipate emotional involvement, escalation, response, and predictability is broken when stillness takes the place of those patterns. Furthermore, it is rare to perceive unpredictability calmly. Even when there isn't any intentional meaning, it is frequently taken to mean something else. In quiet, there is also an unpleasant mirror effect. When someone doesn't respond, others are forced to face their own actions without receiving quick response. A comment that used to get a response now gets no response. And that since dispute doesn't provide closure, nothing can seem heavier than it. It leaves the activity open-ended, unproven, uncontested, and unresolved. This is the point at which misperception intensifies. Silence is frequently interpreted as silent superiority, as if not responding were a sort of judgment, rather than as restraint or separation from needless reaction. However, in practice, silence does not always indicate a viewpoint. People eventually start to get used to quiet. They behave differently, speak differently, and occasionally even put distance between them, not because they said anything, but rather because they didn't say anything in return. Even when no pressure was imposed on purpose, the absence of response turns into its own kind of pressure. As a result, others find it difficult to understand quiet. Assumptions, forecasts, and revised plans abound throughout it. But fundamentally, it doesn't alter. It's just a decision to refrain from turning every interaction into an exclamation, every moment into a reaction, and giving noise the power to define presence. Real-time growth seldom seems like a celebration. It feels more like separation, hesitancy from other people, and the subtle unfamiliarity of familiar faces. It doesn't proclaim itself with cheers. It manifests subtly in the way you behave differently. How you become less patient with things you used to put up with, and how your silence becomes more deliberate than reactive. Your tolerance for repetition is one of the first things that changes when you begin to mature. Once normal patterns start to feel burdensome, once entertaining conversations become monotonous, relationships that were sustained by habit begin to feel obligatory. And without realizing it, you start to unquestioningly leave places where you once belonged. Others seldom first comprehend this change. Your internal progress is invisible to others. They only notice the change on the outside. They observe that you are not as responsive, available, or emotionally approachable as you once were. Additionally, individuals frequently mistake growth for a shift in attitude or emotional detachment. Growth separates you from familiarity because it no longer fits into pre-existing patterns, not because it rejects individuals. You no longer exist in the same way as the version of yourself that used to fit specific surroundings. However, that version is still expected in certain contexts. Confusion also arises when expectation and absence collide. During these times, the subtle tension develops. You are no longer predictable, but you are still there. You're still there, but your emotional roles have changed. Additionally, your growth appears inconsistent to those who depended on that predictability, not because you are unstable, but rather because you are no longer emulating the version of yourself that they found comfortable. This is the natural formation of distance, emotional and psychological, but not always physical. Discussions get shorter. Selective energy exchange occurs. What once seemed straightforward now takes modification on both sides as shared comfort zones start to diminish. Some people are unwilling to do this. Your internal standards are also altered by growth. Things that were formerly deemed appropriate start to seem superfluous. When it's not necessary, you quit explaining yourself. You give up trying too hard to keep up relationships that aren't reciprocated. You cease engaging in situations where you must diminish yourself in order to maintain equilibrium. And each of those pauses results in a quiet detachment. Individuals frequently take that separation personally. They believe it is aimed at them, but it is actually aimed at patterns. However, humans frequently embody patterns, making it difficult to distinguish between them. What you outgrow on the inside is perceived by them as a change in how you treat them on the outside. The greatest misconception about progress is that it doesn't necessarily involve conflict. There is neither a clear explanation nor an announcement. At first, the gap is subtle and nearly undetectable. but eventually it becomes apparent enough to be disregarded. Additionally, by that point, both sides are already using distinct interpretations of reality. While growth may not always lead to conflict, it does produce disparity. And consciousness is compelling by contrast. It displays what no longer functions at the same frequency, what no longer feels natural, and what no longer aligns. And once that understanding emerges, it becomes challenging to revert to earlier dynamics, not out of pride but out of recognition. Growth does not necessitate rejection of others, yet it frequently leads to perceived rejection nonetheless, which further complicates this division. People notice the absence more than the aim when you cease engaging in the same emotional conversations. Furthermore, assumptions are frequently made when there is no explanation. Growth thus becomes a silent barrier, not because it deliberately pushes people away, but rather because it lets go of things that don't fit. And there, familiarity starts to wane, not because of conflict, but rather because of evolution that doesn't wait for comprehension to catch up.